Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This is the lesson on tissues. Now, of course, when we say tissues, we're not talking about blowing your nose kind of tissues. We're talking about a bunch of cells together with some common purpose, some functional goal in terms of what they're doing for your body. So it is cells organized into groups for a specific set of functions or purposes. Sometimes it's just one purpose, a lot of times it's many. Epithelial tissue is the first one we're going to talk about. And epithelium, that's the other way to put it, is always cells that are on the outermost part, the most superficial layer of an organ, or the innermost part, the deepest parts of an organ. So if they're in the innermost parts, that organ has some kind of passageway or hollow area. It's called a lumen. And the cells on the innermost part, those epithelial cells, are probably helping to move something through, absorbing chemicals, secreting chemicals. It could be a variety of things. So epithelium, very plentiful in your body, extremely important. Connective tissue, the most abundant tissue in your body, because connective tissue is a lot of different kinds of cells functioning together. It really does connect your body parts to each other and help bind organs to neighboring tissues. Muscle tissue and neural tissue are technically a type of connective tissue, but these are major tissues in the human body. You're going to find muscle tissue all throughout the body, even in parts where you don't realize it's there, because some of your muscles are doing involuntary actions that you don't directly control consciously. So muscles are actually in your dermis. You actually have muscles in your skin that you don't consciously move, but they do contract and relax without you realizing it. Neural tissue, also all throughout the body. It's not just the brain, not just the spinal cord. We're talking every single nerve, all the neurons, billions and billions of cells. Histology, very important kind of branch or study related to anatomy and physiology. That's the study of tissues. And to be more specific, it's really looking up close at a tissue to see what the cells look like and how they're oriented, related to each other. So that's why it's typically with a microscope that you're going to be looking at some kind of histological picture. And actually later on in this lesson, I will show you a histology slide. So the first kind of tissue we're going to talk about is epithelial tissue, also called epithelium. The purpose of epithelium is to cover every external and internal surface of the body, not just on the outside, but internal organs as well. These epithelial tissues are always attached to a basal lamina, also known as a basement membrane. That's the other kind of synonym for this term. Here's what's meant by that. You're going to see on pictures I'm going to either draw for you or have displayed on the slide later on in this lesson that it's always cells bound to what looks like just a line. Looks like kind of like cement, like a cement line that the cells are attached to and anchored to. That basement membrane or basal lamina isn't actually made of cells. It's kind of like, think of it as an organic protein glue that's anchoring all those cells to that surface. And then that basement membrane is connected to whatever tissue is immediately below it or deep to it. So basement membrane you're going to find associated with every epithelium. Also, epithelium is avascular. It gets nutrients and gases from diffusion and or osmosis. So what does avascular mean specifically? Vascular, let's take the cardiovascular system, always has to do with transporting fluids. So for instance, a vascular plant like a tree is called that because the tree is able to suck water up and get it up through osmosis to the tippy tops of its leaves. That's a vascular plant. We are vascular because we're able to move fluids against gravity all throughout our body. But this specific tissue is avascular because when you look at blood vessels and the transport of fluids related to this, the blood vessels don't actually go right up into it. So you're not seeing capillaries, those tiny blood vessels of your body, feeding this directly with oxygen and nutrients. The oxygen and nutrients, the gases that are going to be given to these tissues, get there from whatever tissue is right next to it. So it's diffusion and osmosis that's getting the nutrients and gases to the epithelial tissues. And because we're talking about parts that are on the very outside of your body, on the passageways that you're swallowing stuff into or inhaling air into, they're consistently damaged by a wide variety of environmental factors, regenerated with stem cells. You're getting pretty much constant regeneration of these epithelial tissues depending on where they are in the body. So let's take the epithelium on the surface of the tongue. That needs to be regenerated a lot because every time that tongue cells get rubbed up against by something you're chewing or eating, you're going to need to replace those. Same with the epidermis, the outer parts of your skin. I'm getting rid of thousands right now by doing this. So yeah, you do need to regenerate them as they get damaged. So those are some characteristics of epithelial tissues in general. So now the types of epithelium. They are named based on cell structure and shape, and I'll give you some examples momentarily, and is it one layer, two layers, many layers? So let's look at an example. Simple squamous epithelium. Why is it simple? Why is it squamous? Well, simple has to do with how many layers it is. This means one layer. That's as simple as it gets. Later on, you're going to see stratified as a word. So stratified is the opposite of one layer. We're talking many, many layers on top of one another. Squamous, this means round or disc-like. Yeah, so they look like that. That's a squamous cell. So one layer of round or disc-like cells. That's what simple squamous epithelium is. And you're going to see more detail about that later on in this lesson. Here it is, simple squamous epithelium. One layer of plate-shaped, I said disc-shaped, but same thing, plate-shaped cells. They just look like this. Meant for areas that need a high rate of diffusion and osmosis through the cells. So think about inhaling air or transporting nutrients through blood vessels. You want to get the oxygen to your cells as quickly as possible. You want to get nutrients like sugars and proteins and fats as quickly to cells as possible. You don't want to having them drift through layers and layers of cells. It would take longer and be harder to get that stuff around the body. So two examples are the alveolar walls and capillary walls. Let's see. Here's a good picture of how they look. So let's say we were to take a capillary, which is the tiniest blood vessel type in the human body. And if we were to cut that capillary down the middle, because it's a tube, let's say we cut it and we could look down it with a microscope, the walls would be one cell thick, simple, and squamous, because if you looked from the outside of it, you would see all these disc-like cells that make up these right here. So I'm also going to draw a little nucleus. And since it's one cell thick, what a capillary does is it gets oxygen to the tissues around it. So you get a very quick diffusion, passive natural movement of gases and nutrients out of the capillary into the tissue, and vice versa with CO2 and waste, and you'll take those back to the lungs so you can breathe out the CO2 molecules. So having one cell thick, great for quick diffusion and osmosis. And alveolar walls, if you're wondering what are those? Well, if we look at the capillaries in the lungs, you want to get the CO2 out of the capillaries and into the passageways of your lungs for exhaling, and vice versa with the oxygen. Well, they're kind of like microscopic bubbles that make up the alveoli of your lungs. You have hundreds of millions of these little air sacs. They are also one cell thick. So here's a alveolar bundle. If we were to take a cross section through the alveolar bundle, guess what? Also one cell thick. And so it's brilliant in terms of getting oxygen that you've inhaled into your lungs into the capillaries quickly and efficiently. And so that's ideal for diffusion and osmosis. Simple squamous epithelium. Now, stratified squamous epithelium, we still have those round plate-looking cells, but a stack of them, many layers of these plate-shaped cells, meant for areas that have to deal with or do with a lot of friction or rubbing. Like I mentioned earlier, the epidermis of the skin, it's being touched, rubbed. You need to regenerate those cells because you're going to lose them. The surface of the tongue. The esophagus, that's the tube that takes food from your throat area down into your stomach. every time you swallow a chunk of food, it's rubbing against the inner part of that esophagus. It's called the mucosa, and you're losing those cells. You need to be able to regenerate that epithelial tissue. The vagina or the anus, you're going to have friction in those areas too, depending on what activity you're engaged in. So you got to be able to regenerate these epithelial tissues because of those environmental sources of friction. Here's a little image of what they would look like. You can see that they're still, roundish. And then as you get towards the surface, here's the superficial part of it. This could be the epidermis of the skin. It makes sense that these flattened cells here are worn away from the top. And down here, cell division of these, in a sense, stem cells are going to be providing the new cells that gradually move away from the blood supply down here. And look, this black line right down here, that's the basal lamina or basement membrane. So this is stratified squamous epithelium, ideal for friction or protection. Here's a histological slide of part of the esophagus and stomach connection. So I can show you some actual micrographs, which means photograph taken with a microscope. So this is zoomed in really close, and this passageway right here, this is the lumen of the lower part of the esophagus, the most inferior part of the esophagus, and here is the beginning of the stomach, and here's the lumen of the stomach. So you're going to have mucosa lining that inner part of the stomach. And you're actually going to have some mucus glands that are going to be on the esophagus, but what you also need to have stacked on the innermost part of the esophagus is lots of this stratified squamous epithelium. So you can see that there's stacks and stacks of those round cells because every time food rubs against it, it's going to damage parts of it. And so the mitosis down here is bringing up new epithelium here. You're going to see all kinds of epithelial tissues in the stomach. For instance, right here, you've got some glandular epithelium. You're going to hear more about that later. These are secreting gastric juice and all those little chemicals and molecules inside the stomach to help with the digestion process. Another kind of epithelium, simple columnar. This is one layer, because it's simple, of column-shaped cells, like the name says. Meant for absorption and secretion typically. So it just depends on what specific organ we're in. Sometimes they are absorbing something, they're taking something in from the passageway, or they're secreting something into that passageway or lumen. Sometimes they have what are called microvilli, and I'll actually draw some microvilli for you right here. They look like little hairs on the surface. And actually, epithelial cells are known as cells with polarity, meaning that one end of the cell usually functions a little bit differently than the other end in terms of the look of it and the structure. And you could see that with simple columnar. Down here, this is the anchored part of the cell that's going to be adjacent to the basement membrane. And up at this end, if we're talking about a space or lumen, this is the end that's actually doing the absorbing or secreting, and these little microvilli are going to be going like this. For instance, in the lining of the stomach and intestines, you definitely have to be absorbing stuff and secreting stuff. Like if we take the small intestine, you definitely need to have the ability to further the process of digestion, and the small intestine, very long tube in your body that's doing a lot of absorption. So these cells are perfect for that. Stratified columnar is very similar to the previous picture, but you're actually going to see stacks of these cells. And yeah, I could add a nucleus or nuclei to all of these, but just for the sake of time, that's good enough. And here's that basement membrane. And sometimes these also have cilia on the top. Not necessarily, though. So stratified columnar epithelium, many layers, column-shaped cells. They could even be more than this, meant for protection. Similar function to that stratified squamous epithelium, but the cells are just shaped differently. Locations, the epiglottis. The epiglottis is actually a flap that comes down on the entrance to your airway, to your trachea, every time you swallow. Because oftentimes when a human being is swallowing, they're getting food or liquid down into their digestive tract, And you don't want it going down into the lungs. So the epiglottis is a nice flap that protects us from aspirating on something other than air. The anus and the urethra also need protection based on what's going through those areas. Pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Pseudo meaning like fake or false. Stratified meaning many layers, and columnar shape. So kind of a false stratification, and that's because it appears to be layered, but it is one layer of column-shaped cells. And the reason why it appears to be layered is the varying heights of nuclei give it the illusion of being many layers. So let me draw you a picture. Sometimes you get one of them being smashed in like that. I'll do another one that's kind of smashed in. But you can see that this is one layer of epithelium of column-shaped cells. But you'll see this. So because you have varying heights of nuclei, at first glance you might think, oh yeah, it's 2 layers, it's more than 1 layer. But it isn't. So it just appears that way. Sometimes these have cilia. Actually, oftentimes. It just depends on where. So cilia, I mentioned cilia in the previous slide, but let me explain more here. Similar to microvilli, the difference is that cilia usually are helping brush something along rather than the absorbing kind of process or secreting. So think about the lining of the trachea and bronchi. These are tubes associated with breathing in air and exhaling. You generate mucus in your lungs, and if it wasn't for the sweeping up, brushing up of mucus so that you can hock a loogie, you would actually end up drowning in your own fluids, especially when you're sick. So the brushing up of that mucus that's generated in the passageway of the lungs, very important. So in the trachea and bronchi, you're going to see lots of cilia brushing up mucus almost constantly. Simple cuboidal epithelium, one layer of cube-shaped cells meant mainly for secretion and absorption. Secretion, absorption, and protection, SAP, those are that's the way I remember it. Those are the 3 major functions of epithelium. Those are the big 3 you're going to see a lot. Secretion, absorption, protection. One or the other, or some combination of the 3. When we look at kidney tubules, the little tubes that help make urine, that's going to eventually go to the urinary bladder, you're going to see these. And the thyroid gland, which has a lot to do with regulating your metabolic rate. This secretes hormones into the bloodstream. These 2 definitely have simple cuboidal. So if we looked at one of the passageways through which urine, what eventually will become urine, or thyroid gland secretions are found, you're going to see cube shape. So not quite round, kind of the squared off edges. And here's the nuclei. This is your average looking kidney tubule epithelium. So you can see that pretty good for secreting and absorbing stuff. You know, easily things are going to go in and out. So same as simple squamous epithelium, except for the cell structure. So it makes sense that you can easily have secretions going in and absorbing, through this as well. Stratified cuboidal, similar to what I just drew for you, except instead of just one layer, you're going to see additional layers of these cube-shaped cells. So I'm not going to draw all of them, but you're going to have stacks of them, and so on and so forth. So seeing stacks next to some kind of tubular structure, or lumen as this is called, yeah, that's stratified cuboidal. Meant for protection, secretion, and absorption. Like I said earlier, SAP or PSA, whatever you want to remember. Not as common as some of the others I've already told you about in this lesson, but you can find them. So the lining of sweat glands, like in the dermis of your skin, oftentimes if you cut through a sweat gland and you were to look at it under a microscope, that histological view is going to show you stacks of cube-shaped cells. Transitional epithelium, meant for stretching and recoil. You have certain structures in the human body, certain organs, where you need it to expand and then go back once whatever was inside of it has left. So when relaxed, it looks a lot like columnar. So here's your relaxed transitional epithelium, like the lining of the urinary bladder or the uterus. And yes, you'd have the nuclei, of course. So when relaxed, when there's not much in it, they look like that. But then when it is stretched, let's say your urinary bladder has close to a liter of urine in it. That's liter is the max. That means that person's going to really have to urinate. It's stretched quite significantly. So when you stretch out those cube-shaped cells, they don't look cubed. Or sorry, not cube-shaped. The column-shaped cells, they don't look columnar anymore because they are stretched. Yeah, so definitely a big difference between this and this. So think about any organ that's meant to expand. Even the stomach is one. So urinary bladder has urine in it, got to stretch it. Uterus, a baby, got to stretch it. Now I'm going to tell you about glandular epithelium. It's meant for producing and releasing secretions. So anytime that you have a gland, whether it's releasing a secretion outside of the body into a body cavity, it's made of glandular epithelium in terms of the production of what's being secreted and the actual act of secreting it. So there are three main types of glandular epithelium. The first one is merocrine, then apocrine, and then holocrine. And I remember this mnemonic device, Ma, like you're calling your mom, or you're saying ma. And the reason for that is because the order will help you remember what does what, and you'll see why. So the merocrine type, an example is salivary glands. And here we have the different types of salivary glands. There's actually 3 pairs, total of 6 salivary glands in humans. You've got the parotid, sublingual, submandibular, and all of these have the glandular epithelium that is the merocrine type. And merocrine actually secretes just little bits of substances from the cells. So the cells in the epithelium are actually not leaving, just bits of the substance. For example, let's say this is the gland, and here's the opening in which the secretion actually comes into your mouth. Along the edge of it, you have cells that are responsible for producing saliva and secreting it into the cavity or the lumen. And so secretions into here will then exit into the opening of the mouth to help you, dissolve things you're eating. What actually happens is if we were to zoom into one of these cells, there are little sacs, or vesicles is a better name for it, and inside you have water and enzymes. These little sacs will fuse with the edge of the cell, and then you end up getting, let me erase it here, water and these little enzyme packets exiting, and that's really saliva. So if you remember that merocrine is the smallest bits of secretions. You'll see that with apocrine, it's a little bit more. When we look at apocrine glandular epithelium, an example is mammary glands, the glands that actually release milk. When we look at a mammary gland, you'll see it's a little bit different. So here are the cells that are lining that actual lumen or opening. Instead of it just being little packets that are released, they're actually parts of cells. Not the whole cell, but parts. And here's what it would look like. You would actually have, here's the cell with, its little organelles and parts leaving. So you can see that I'm drawing these arrows to show that it's actually getting rid of a section of the cell. And all these little cell parts together make up the milk. All those carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, hormones, etc. that are in breast milk. And so apocrine, a little bit more is released. Not just little packets, but parts of cells. Then we look at holocrine. Let me use a different color. Sebaceous glands. When we look at hairs, so there's a hair shaft. There are glands adjacent to the base of the hair shaft near the follicle. And they release an oily substance to help coat and protect your hairs. And they're associated with the hairs all over your body. Holocrine, the way that I remember it, it being more of a secretion in terms of the amount that's released. Whole, H-O-L, is kind of like saying W-H-O-L-E, like a whole cell. And so the Ma thing I told you about before, merocrine releases little bits, apocrine releases parts of cells, holocrine releases whole cells. So if this was actually the lining of the gland here, this sebaceous gland and this sebaceous gland, you would actually see the whole cell being released as part of that oily glandular secretion. And so those are the three different main types of glandular epithelium. When we look at connective tissues, this is an important tissue in the body. It is the most abundant tissue. It's all over the place. It's connecting the body parts to each other, stabilizing your body, giving it structure and stability. And it is meant to connect and bind together all the organs and organ systems to form a cohesive, cooperative body as a whole. And you have different skeletons here. Of course, on the far right, that's a human skeleton. We've got gorilla, chimpanzee, gibbon, orangutan. And whether you're looking at a primate, or we are a primate, but whether you're looking at a monkey, an ape, or a human, the skeleton is made of connective tissue. So when we look at connective tissue, anything that is found throughout the body, helping to bind organs to each other, helping to let the body communicate with itself, it's probably connective tissue. And if you think about it, bones really do connect body parts to each other via joints. And if it wasn't for your bones, well, you wouldn't be alive. So connective tissue is made up of connective tissue fibers and cells. So first we're going to talk about the fibers. The fibers are made of protein. Protein, the most abundant solid substance in the body. If you were to remove all the water from a body, protein is your next most abundant substance. Collagen fibers, collagen, one of the most abundant proteins in the body. It is a bundle of protein units that are slightly flexible, or that is slightly flexible, but very strong and typically arranged in one direction. A good example of that would be tendons. So tendons help connect muscle to bone. Ligaments would help connect bone to bone. So a tendon like, let's take the calcaneal tendon, for example, or the Achilles tendon as it's better known. If you think about how it connects your calf muscle or gastrocnemius to your heel, which is called the calcaneus bone, that's why it's the calcaneus tendon, that Achilles tendon is a band that's in one direction. It's very tough, it's very strong. And of course, it is slightly flexible, because anytime that you contract that muscle, that gastrocnemius, you're going to be pulling up on your heel. And when you relax it, the opposite's going to happen. And all of those aligned in one direction help keep it stable, connect that muscle effectively to that bone. And it is very strong. And anyone who has snapped that tendon knows it's very painful, and they realize how important that tendon is. And typically when it snaps away from the bone, surgery is required to reconnect it. So collagen fibers, not just tendons and ligaments. Collagen's found all throughout your skin. It's in your bones. It's all over the body. Very important. Elastic fibers is another example of a connective tissue fiber. This is not quite as strong, but a lot more flexible. A bundle of protein units that are very flexible, elastic. I mean, it says it right there. But it's still strong, of course, just not quite as strong as collagen. An example is intervertebral discs. So intervertebral discs, if you look at the vertebrae, this is a side view. So what you're looking at here is this side is the anterior side towards the front of your spine bones, and this is the posterior or dorsal side. This would be that little bony extension that makes up those bumps you see on someone's back when they bend over. They're more obvious. And this is a little process that connects to the ribs, for instance, and also muscles can connect there. But anyways, this bone, on the top and bottom of it, you're going to see a disc. And that's why they're called intervertebral discs, because they're in between the vertebrae. And these have to be flexible. They have to have some give and elasticity, because think about when someone jumps off of a ledge or jumps off of something that's pretty high. The amount of force of the bones coming together when you hit the ground, you want to have that cushioning and a little bit of give. So you do have slight elasticity there. As time goes on, the integrity of these and the thickness can drop a bit, and that's why some older people, sometimes the older they get, they actually can be a little bit shorter. My grandmother used to be very close to 5 feet. Now she's more like 4'10", and we can blame some of those intervertebral discs for that little drop in height. But yeah, they're made of these elastic fibers, and a good example of elastic fibers is the name elastin. That's the most common elastic fiber, and you're going to find it in those intervertebral discs. And finally, reticular fibers. Same subunits as collagen, but not in one direction. So remember, with tendons, we have the collagen lined up, in one direction, because that's how the muscle contracts. It contracts along one plane, back and forth. But with reticular fibers, reticular means net. And if you took biology, you remember that the endoplasmic reticulum, that organelle in a cell, kind of looks like a little net next to the nucleus. So reticular fibers, they're net-like. And a good example is inside the liver. These net-like fibers are found throughout the liver to help keep it together and keep it stable. You wouldn't want collagen fibers just lined up along one direction in the liver. You want them kind of spread out and kind of all throughout the tissue to help give it stability and keep it together. So those are connective tissue fibers. Connective tissue cells are another important part of connective tissue. Fibroblasts, for instance, when you get a cut in your skin, fibroblasts are what are helping heal that cut and remake those proteins and secrete those proteins to help bind it back together. So if it's not a thick cut, you won't need, or thick or deep cut, you won't need stitches. If it's a thin cut, your body takes care of it, and oftentimes it won't scar. So you can thank fibroblasts for secreting these connective tissue fibers to help rebind those parts of the skin that have been separated. Macrophages, that literally means big eater, and macrophages are these giant cells. They kind of look like Pac-Man. They will engulf foreign bodies. So let's say you've got a bacterium here, a bacterial cell that is potentially harmful to your body. Here's a nucleus inside of your macrophage, and there's all these little, usually lysosomes, little organelles that have enzymes that are meant for breaking down foreign bodies. So once the macrophage swallows up, remember it's a big eater, that foreign body, little enzymes inside these lysosomes will fuse with the packet that has now engulfed this bacterial cell, and those enzymes will break it down and get rid of it. So macrophages, some of them are fixed. They're kind of like a permanent resident of organs or tissues in the body. Others are free, where they migrate in and out. And the amazing thing is these macrophages can flatten themselves and squeeze in between the cells of tissues. And the ones that are free migrators, it's amazing how they will go and target foreign bodies and get that immune response going. Mast cells. Mast cells secrete a couple different things. They secrete histamine and heparin. So those mast cells, histamine is one of the main things they secrete. And histamine, if you've ever taken an antihistamine, you're familiar with the opposite of what this does. An antihistamine is going to get rid of the swelling, especially in your nasal cavity. So if you have a stuffy nose, it's very uncomfortable. And that's your body's natural response to getting some kind of infection or irritation in your upper respiratory tract. To get inflammation in that area is to get more blood flow and to try to get rid of that problem, that foreign invader that's causing the problem. But it's very uncomfortable. So you take an antihistamine to reduce the swelling. So that tells you that histamine is the cause of inflammation. So this is released to make blood vessels get dilated, and that results in swelling. Heparin is pretty much an anticoagulant, and that means that this will prevent or get rid of blood clots. Sometimes blood clots are a very good thing. A clot prevents more blood from exiting out of a wound, from out of blood vessels. But once the healing has happened and you've repaired the wall of that blood vessel, you want to get rid of that clot. You don't want it to stay there. If it gets dislodged, that clump of a clot could get lodged somewhere where it doesn't belong, and that could cause problems. So heparin will actually thin the blood or get rid of those clots. Lymphocytes, an important cell of the lymphatic system, and lymphatic tissue is all throughout the body. That is connecting body parts to each other. And lymphocytes are responsible for making antibodies. So this can actually give rise to what's called a plasmocyte. And a plasmocyte helps to get antibodies to areas where you have a certain kind of foreign invader, and antibodies are part of that immune response, which you'll hear more about in the lymphatic system lessons. Adipocytes. Adipocytes look like giant yellowish cells, and in the corner, kind of shoved over to the side, you'll see a nucleus. And some people say that a cross-section of adipocytes looks like a class ring because this yellow, well, the plasma membrane can oftentimes look a little different than yellow, but inside you're going to see lots and lots of yellow. But their point is that it looks like a class ring because you have that edge and then this little nucleus off to the side kind of squeezed to one corner, and that looks like the jewel of a class ring. So I'm drawing this all yellow because lipids, or fats in the body, are stored in adipocytes, and this literally means a cell that contains fat. So you have all this fat jam-packed inside of the plasma membrane in the cytoplasm of this cell, and the nucleus is just squeezed over to the side because of all that fat. So that's a typical look for an adipocyte. And then finally, melanocytes. So melanocytes, they make melanin. So melanin is that pigment that gives your skin, hair, and iris within the eye its color. And so these cells found all throughout your skin, they are stimulated to make melanin. And there are genetic factors associated with that, and of course environmental factors like UV radiation. And finally, connective tissue examples. So when you get combinations of those fibers that I told you about and cells, that makes up the different types of connective tissues. Adipose tissue, like I mentioned before, you're going to have adipocytes storing that fat in the body. The most abundant site for adipose tissue is going to be in the deepest parts of your integumentary system. So the lowest parts or deepest parts of your skin, called the hypodermis, is a site where you have lots of adipocytes. And of course, the amount of fat storage varies from person to person, and it varies in different parts of the body, right? Your buttocks area typically has a lot more adipose storage than in your hands, for instance. Tendons and ligaments, definitely tendons and ligaments made of a lot of connective tissue fibers, but you also have cells in the neighborhood, like fibroblasts, that can reinforce or make little repairs if need be. Now, if you tear your ACL in your knee, the anterior cruciate ligament, if you completely tear it, you're probably going to need surgery to get a new strong ligament in there. But if you have microscopic tears, that cause a little bit of pain after you do make that injury happen, you're going to have cells that can actually reinforce and remake parts of those fibers, and sometimes people don't need surgery with those tiny little tears. Your body can compensate for that. Blood. Blood is definitely a connective tissue. There are lots of blood proteins associated with this particular tissue, and of course, there's all kinds of blood cells. Macrophages is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of cells that are assisting in terms of blood flow around your body. Cartilage, soft bone. Cartilage found in every movable joint in your body, found in the nose, the ears, etc. Very important. You not only have a lot of fibers associated with cartilage, but cells that can produce those fibers and release them to make that cartilage. And then bone, of course, it's a lot harder than cartilage. Collagen fibers very abundant in bone. And of course, cells. Without cells in the bone, you're not going to be able to produce that collagen and maintain the integrity of your bones. And muscle. Muscles, of course, made of muscle fibers. And those fibers, individual muscle cells, are jam-packed with proteins. So these are just several examples of connective tissue types in the human body. And thanks for watching Educator.com.